Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining my session this morning about enacting young children's rights in education. Today I want to talk about three things really that adults can do to encourage authentic engagement and participation with children in schools. I'm going to explain briefly how these things are underpinned by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. But don't worry if you're not familiar with the convention, because hopefully this will get you thinking about it, and I'm going to share some resources about it afterwards. When I'm talking about the child in today's session, I'm going to talk about children up to the age of 18. But today's session I focused particularly around younger children with some of my examples, because I really want to emphasize that all these things that we're talking about we need to be aware of right from birth. So if nothing else after this session is you go and become a little bit more familiar with the rights of the child, then I'll feel I've done my job. Okay, so the 3 points I'm going to talk about today relate to these two articles, Article 29 and 12. But the 54 articles outlined in the Rights of the Child Convention, they're not designed to be viewed in isolation. And if you're familiar with them, you'll know that there's a right to protect, a right for provision such as education, and the right that we're going to talk about today is the right to participation. I hope you can hear me. I noticed that someone's having a problem with their speaker. Please do type in if you can't hear me very well, and I'll try and readjust my position to help. Okay. So in education, I think we've become much better at consulting children, asking them about what they think. You know, in early years, we've got loads of child-led learning happening in brilliant settings across the country. And in schools, you think about, we've introduced different forms of formative feedback in the classroom, but, and there's always a but, I think we need to recognise that in some cases, our participation and engagement with children and parents in schools and settings can be a bit tick boxy, okay? And I think that's because we've got a lot of external pressures sometimes and accountability that forces us to kind of think sometimes in the wrong direction. You know, it distracts us from the child who should be at the centre of all this. So, and I want to emphasise the word unintentional, okay, because a lot of the behaviours that we're going to talk about today are unintentional, and basically they're not intended to kind of be behaviours. No one walks into a classroom or work with a group of children and deliberately thinks, okay, I'm going to say something that's going to upset them. You know, I'm going to do something that's going to upset these children today, okay? But as professionals, we need to be constantly reflecting on our behaviours, which is why the first point I want to talk about is about being aware of being able to identify and challenge our implicit bias, okay? So implicit bias is basically unintentional biases and built around our attitudes, our beliefs and stereotypes based around these factors, okay? And they can affect how we treat others, okay? You know, ability, language, gender, culture, race. So why is it important in schools and settings for us to be so aware of these as professionals? Well, it can affect how we perceive and respond to children, okay? And that can lead to really unfair differences in treatment. And research shows that children as young as 3 years old and sometimes earlier can show prejudiced behaviour and attitudes, okay? So we need to think about our attitudes as adults because we're shaping them. And we know that education is really important to reduce discrimination and violence in society. And we've seen a lot of that, haven't we, in recent media, about getting us to really think about the role we have to play in educating children. And the British values and the prevent strategy and these documents that if you're already working in teaching, you'll be very familiar with, and you know, they're there for a very good reason. So let's think about culture, for example, and the aspects that we teach in our classrooms, maybe linked to RE or people in the communities in early years. It might be traditional food that we introduce the children to, or celebratory dances. And I want you to think about whether you think we are always 100% respectful. And I'm going to give you an example. So, you know, if you're setting up a Chinese restaurant as a role play area to celebrate Chinese New Year, and Chinese New Year is one of those cultures that we time and time again gets rolled out in schools. Now, setting up that role play area may seem harmless, but is it really? You know, what are children learning from that experience about that culture? You know, what stereotypes might we be embedding inadvertently in children? Okay, so that's the type of thing I want to get you thinking about, you know, things that seem very subtle and harmless, but actually can have bigger implications. Because we need to remember that with all of these factors here that we're looking at, what you read and hear about specific cultural groups, a race, different abilities, they're general trends, okay? And they do not always apply to every family or child. And we've got to recognise that early on, because in education, we like to label and we like to group children into neat little boxes, okay? And this is where implicit bias kind of, you know, develops from, really. So let's, I've put this slide in, just have a look at this additional reflection point. We're not going to have time to talk about this in lots of detail today, but I'm hoping you'll go back and have a look at it. And it's a conceptual diagram which shows the cultural biases that, you know, the culture we can easily observe on the top layer, okay? And these are some of the things that we approach and talk about a lot in schools, I think. All right, but underneath we've got that deeper culture that's not as easily observed, and with these concepts our value-based behaviours have a really big role to play. So, you know, if you look down right at the bottom, we've got ideas of cleanliness. Well, you know, your own views on whether a child looks clean or how you view cleanliness in your home will affect how you also then view that in a setting environment. Okay, so, you know, these are good conversational points to be having with staff. So the first thing I want you to remember is that we need to learn how to identify and address these biases if we want us to be genuinely inclusive. Okay, all right, so that's really important to remember. So let's have a look then at how we address some of these biases, because this is the important bit. We need to identify it in ourselves, and then we need to be also able to identify and support other people. So, you know, addressing cultural and personal biases can be uncomfortable, you know, challenging to address. Different people are going to respond in different ways, and we've seen that, haven't we, play out across social media with all of the Black Lives Matter. You know, different people are responding in different ways. So how might a member of staff respond, and how is that going to impact on the child? So, you know, the first adult there at the top is that head in the sand, the member of staff who's going to try and ignore the discrimination and the prejudice. You know, they tend to ignore those unwanted behaviours as well. You know, if I'm not commenting, I'm not implicit. And, you know, with these adults, children don't learn to think about or deal with the issues that are surrounding them. And, they're going to be less likely to question what they hear from other people. And I mean, there's a bigger implication in terms of trust here. We're shutting down conversations. So, is that adult going to be an adult that a child is going to disclose or share something with? Probably not. Okay, so the opportunities for building relationships between the adult and child are lost there. All right. And then we've got the giving out adult, the adult who tells children what to think. They might have all their resources, deliver a very strong factual lesson, but they never allow any time to discuss anything. And we can see this in trainee teachers sometimes early on. They are, they've got their content, they want to deliver all the knowledge, but they're petrified of having to be asked a question that they may not know the answer to. All right, and we can do this in our actions as well, because think about if you take a class on an educational visit to a place of worship, or if there are artifacts out on display in your continuous provision. If you're not discussing them, if there's no follow-up afterwards, then it's very tokenistic. Okay, so that is definitely a behaviour that we want to try and avoid. So then we've got the adults that make space for those conversations and give children time to explore what they think, and also tell them their views as well. So it's a two-way relationship. But for this to happen really effectively, we need adults to be able to be open and honest, okay? And it's really important at this stage that we're not avoiding tricky questions. And it can be difficult, can't it? Because, we're not going to be experts in everything. But if you answer questions simply and factually, it's a good first step. And maybe look to find out why the child is asking. So remove the focus on the what and think about why are they asking that. Is it something they've heard in the classroom? Is it something that's going on at home? Is it something they've seen on YouTube? Where are they getting that information from? So then we've got where we ideally want to be for the majority of the time is that adult that gets support and finds out about things that they're not sure about, discusses them, and we know through discussing and talking about things that we learn. We want children to develop skills and give them confidence and a conscience. We need to draw on that, and training in your school and setting and having conversations like this are really key, because each year you are going to be faced with a new group of children coming through, and they're going to bring different experiences and different cultures. Okay, so overall we want to see the big picture. We want to be that adult that sees the big picture and encourages children to make links between their lives, what's going on for them, and the lives of other people in the wider community. All right, so I think by starting and thinking about how you respond and how maybe others in your school or setting respond is a really good place to start. Okay, so thinking about that, how you view children is also, I believe, really important as part of this ongoing reflection. And like those different stages we've talked about with the adults, this will shift as well. You may at times think children are very much vulnerable in need, and other times active and competent. We know it's not that simple. Okay. For example, do you feel the same way now about your own children or the children that you teach and their education as you did before the pandemic? We've been reminded about the vulnerable children, the anxious children, and I think it's instinctive in our profession to want to protect them at the moment, isn't it? But remember what we said about the danger of generalisations. There'll be many children who have thrived during lockdown and haven't felt anxious. You know, so how about them? So if we're treating all children as vulnerable and in need, then, you know, that can lead to those biases breeding unfair behaviours again. And of course, all those implicit factors that we've just looked at will affect our thoughts on capability. So it's not just about culture, it's about gender as well, you know, such as, well, boys thrive on competition, don't they? So you might be joining Matt Pinkett's session on Boys Don't Try, and I'd really recommend it. You know, it's great to get you thinking about, you know, we need high expectations for boys as well as girls. You know, there's lots of stereotypes out there for both. You know, oh, girls are better at English and not so good at maths. You know, boys need that competition to get them going, to motivate them. All right, okay. Yet again, you know, be cautious of the generalization. So I'm just going to use this example to just talk about tokenism briefly. Okay, so, you know, my second point is to avoid tokenism and to avoid those tokenistic behaviours, we need to be consistently open and honest and mindful of our levels of engagement. Okay, and I'm using social media as a kind of example here. All right, and to do this, we need to ensure that, you know, our interactions with children and the wider community are seen as being authentic, because we don't want to be the head in the sand giving out adult, do we? You know, because we know that if we are, we're going to be less likely to be trusted and listened to. So if we think about school and nursery photographs on social media pages, and I didn't want to particularly pick one and pull one out because, you know, it's all about context, isn't it? We know that sometimes what's presented outwardly can be in itself biased. So next time a picture pops up from your school or another school or setting, think about, you know, why is this picture being posted? Is it to celebrate the children's achievements? Is it for marketing? Or is it both? You know, is it clear? I mean, are children in your school or setting being deliberately chosen to be photographed because of their culture, so that a school or setting can appear more diverse and inclusive than it really is? I mean, you know, that's then a completely different spin, isn't it? And I suppose thinking about the children's participation, what age do we involve children in consenting to their photograph being on social media as part of a school or being shared more broadly? You know, often it's the parents, isn't it, as gatekeepers who sign consent. But, you know, I know, having a secondary school age child, that, you know, I'm still signing for my secondary school age child. So, you know, at what point, you know, do we say actually they need to be involved in this process? And then how transparent are we being as a provider to our community and parents about what we're posting? All right. So, you know, just some other things to go back to and revisit. So this is all bringing together about authentic participation. And, you know, we have to be constantly reflecting on our own and others' level of engagement and authenticity. So in our behaviours, you know, in our curriculum, in the wider community. And if you look at this diagram here, we want to avoid being continually in the red, where the intentions to engage families and children are not done meaningfully, okay? And I think we've got to be careful not to confuse meaningful engagement, involvement with meaningful engagement. You know, you can consult parents about something, but if it's been predetermined and it's all been decided, then it's not very meaningful, is it? So I'm going to wrap up this session by revisiting the three things that I really want you to take away, okay? That I believe promote authentic engagement and participation. So the first one is really looking at yourself, okay? Teaching involves continuous learning and reflexivity. You know, don't come into the profession if you're not prepared to do that. And it's one which starts with looking at our own behaviours and implicit bias. So we need to firstly learn how to challenge our personal and cultural bias, okay? Relationships are key, and if we want to build authentic and trusting relationships with teachers, schools, nurseries, we need to be mindful constantly of these levels of engagement, you know, with our children and with the wider community. You know, we want to work in partnership with them. We say we are sometimes, but are we really? Okay. And then this really brings us to the final point, okay, that, you know, the world is changed by your example as a professional, you know, not by your opinion. You know, we don't want head in the sand adults teaching children. We want them, you know, we want those teachers that make meaningful connections, okay? So it's, you know, it's not overly complicated, but it does require us to really stop, pause, and have a look at whether some of our daily practices are genuine or not. Okay, so as I said, it was always going to be a quick 20-minute run through. I've put the references here for some of those points that you might want to revisit. I'm going to be posting them on the site. I'm also going to be tweeting some of them out. I really appreciate you dropping in, listening to what I've had to say today. It's really important that we keep this conversation going. And if you don't follow me already on Twitter, please join me at @NicMasters2. And I've popped another podcast on there at the bottom in case you're interested about further biases in preschool education. Have a brilliant day. I hope you get to join some of the other sessions, and I'll hopefully get to see you then. All right, thank you very much.